Hello, everyone, and thank you to Alicia and the conference committee for the invitation to speak to you all today. To my community music friends and allies, I will be speaking directly to you today, but also to anyone that works across the arts sector, and I include in that music schools of higher learning. I begin with a whakatauki, or a proverb, at the top of the slide in Te Reo Māori, my native tongue, and it refers to, in translation, culture is thriving, the people are well, and what that really means for us is if our culture is doing well, and that could mean any interpretation of culture, but we think of culture as entwined with the arts, then the well-being of the people is assured. I think that's at the heart of community music, and I would argue that outcome should be at the center of the arts sector, the music industry, and perhaps the impact we want our arts practice to be on our communities, on our nations, and on our populations. I always begin with a little bit of a summary of what I will be discussing, and so my discussion points today are, I'd like to begin with my positionality. I think that's important, or as I prefer to say, I like to declare my biases right up front. And what I do, I like to talk about what I actually do day to day and how I do it. I'm going to talk about the problems with norms. And this popular social science concept is central to today's presentation and my work. It is an area of particular interest to those of us that sit outside the culture of power, those that are from marginalized communities, those populations that have a history of cultural suppression, who are trying to find equality in society at all levels. And then I'd like to talk about shifting values to create new norms that may be more inclusive. Norms and values to me are very connected, but how we shift the values so that we have new behaviors that create new norms is challenging, and particularly in well-entrenched practices and conventions that may have been inherited from other cultures. Then, of course, how that works in application, which is really a systems change, and how that works across the arts sector. And then I'll end with some considerations about how community musicians can support arts organizations in rethinking their values. I do not take it for granted that people know where Aotearoa New Zealand is and who Māori are. You will notice I am using the Māori word for New Zealand first, which is not uncommon for people in my country at this moment. Māori settled in New Zealand before British colonization, and we came via many islands in the Pacific. But essentially, from the French Polynesia Tahitian area, across to the Cook Islands, and then down to New Zealand. But we traveled historically backwards and forwards across the Pacific. I think it's always useful to have a picture of that space, so I include a map. Where it is, how far away it is from Europe. And while it's really possible many of you have been here, or at least to Australia, we are 3.5 hours east of Australia. I am Māori and was raised in the culture and connect with 3 tribes genealogically: Kaitahu, Ngāti Ruanui, and Ngāpuhi. I'm mostly American educated. I did go to school in New Zealand, but then I went to university in North America. I studied voice at New England Conservatory in Boston, but I've spent a lot of my life in New York and at the University of Texas in Austin. I have worked in London and I've also lived in Germany. I'm very grateful for that education. For someone of my generation coming from New Zealand who is Indigenous, these were unusual and extraordinary opportunities. Currently, I work in the largest university in Aotearoa, New Zealand, teaching for over 15 years in a school of music, where I have coordinated the classical voice program. While I love teaching classical voice, I think my work in developing community music facilitators, leaders, and teachers in a colonial country may be the most important work I do. I am passionate about this and it aligns with my core values. I was also the first Indigenous co-chair of the Community Music Activities Research Commission of ISME, the International Society of Music Education, and a founding member of Decolonizing and Indigenizing Music Education, a special interest group of that same group. Outside academia is where some of my most interesting work happens. I have been on several governance boards. Sistema Aotearoa, an orchestral training program based on the Venezuelan program. It is housed largely in a lower socioeconomic area of the largest urban city, Auckland, and is ethnically largely Pacific Island. I also work with Prima Volta Charitable Trust, which is a regional program which lets teenagers explore their unique potential within the context of sung performance. I'm also recently stepped down, but have been on the Opera New Zealand Trust, which I will use it as an example of how community music values, when infused in an arts organization at a national level, can have important outcomes. Today's keynote really brings together all of that experience and in particular focuses on my work with New Zealand Opera as a case study of a peak organization drawing strategic activities from community music values. So there are some questions I bring to every situation, whether it be governance committees, university curriculum development, questions that I think are important and they show my biases. So I'd like to be clear about them right up front. So the first one is, who is being excluded in the celebration of this art or the uplifting of this art? Who decides what is high-end art? I think we intrinsically know what our culture calls high-end art, even though they may not use those words. And then again, what stories are important to tell in the arts, and through music. How do the values of our music institutions of learning interact with the arts sector? For me, that's really important because the reason I focus very much on curriculum and my university situation in the School of Music is because we can change the values of those students that are being dispersed or disseminated out into the arts sector as performers, teachers, art directors, curators, and through them we can shift conventions that have become entrenched as norms. I believe this is how we make changes. This is how we refresh and innovate our sector. And then the interesting question, should community music values be at the center of the arts sector? And finally, who benefits from the dominance or superiority of European art music values across the sector? So I'm thinking globally here. I'm going to just leave that with you while I keep going. So what I do. I indigenize spaces, and that's a very interesting term. I'm using Hoskins and Jones' term, but their work has followed on from Canadian Indigenous academics, Gaudry and Lorenz. It is a strategic alternative to Indigenous inclusion, i.e. including the population, which most universities have followed without really addressing the systemic issues and predominant values that restrict the advancements of Indigenous across society. And you can replace Indigenous with marginalized. It is about changing the values or entwining the Indigenous ways of knowing, being, and doing in the system that is presenting that content or learning. I'm very heavily involved in that in the School of Music and music education globally as a part of the Decolonizing Music Education project. Another way of saying that is that I'm really interested in the disciplinary norms and what we understand as excellence. I question norms that have become entrenched and the suppressive models that have become unquestioned. I advocate for norms entrepreneurs, the term Hoffman uses. He suggests that these are people who go about changing the practices by looking at things differently. And in my context, for sure, that means I have to support quite often marginalized or minority opinions, find funding to explore and implement innovative ideas, and I'm often met with a lot of resistance. I'm inspired by Steinhilper and his work in international relations and his work as a migration scholar. I'm interested in reversing the flow of norms from West to the rest to the West. So I spoke about this at a keynote for the Sims Symposium last year, and about how I spend a lot of time rewiring non-Indigenous minds because I deal with a lot of reactivity in people that don't come from a marginalized culture and who have never had their privilege questioned. But again, I will leave that with you to think about. Let's move into the theoretical terms that are used in this presentation. One of the most frequently cited definitions of norms is that offered by Finnemore and Sickink, which is a standard of appropriate behavior for actors within a given identity. Or for my purposes today, they are the shared rules and expectations that define the values of a group and shape the interactions and behaviors of that group. Arguably one of the most widely studied topics in contemporary international relations, Carla Winstone is perhaps one of the more notable scholars in that field, but they identify and describe and analyze the emergence, diffusion, evolution, and effect of norms in the international system. These are generally used for big world problems, but when they're mapped onto the norms of classical music and used as the tool to unpack some of the sociological issues in our sector, there is potential for more sustainable sociocultural change and innovation. I also suggest that in many contexts, including my colonial context, norms unmoderated can perpetuate suppressive power dynamics. So by this, I mean norms of our disciplinary field, music, and by extension, the professional music sector, and perhaps our community music sector may operate within a set of unacknowledged natural rules described by Epstein as a set of internalized prescriptions as chosen. She explains that this is the power of norms, that they can be taken for granted and unquestioned. I take these statements into curriculum development, but also governance situations across the arts sector and some of the organizations I work with. I put this lens on community music training and encourage my students to consider it in the context they work. And I include it as a theoretical underpinning when assessing funding applications and ethics applications. To facilitate changing our values and practices, it is useful to understand how norms unknowingly impact our thoughts and decisions around curriculum, strategic objectives, and policy making, and develop a more effective model that can achieve our desired outcomes. Winston supports this approach and suggests a problem can often be resolved by examining the structure of the norms themselves. So norms have a three-part structure consisting of a problem, which is an issue to be addressed, a value, a belief about how something should be, and a behavior, the actions to be taken to address the given problems and allow the participants to achieve the value. In short, a problem inhibits the full uptake of the value and requires some corrective behavior. To go deeper, norms and values are distinct but interconnected concepts that play a crucial role in shaping individual behavior and societal structures. Values represent broad ideals or principles that guide what is considered good or desirable norms. On the other hand, they are specific rules, expectations, and behaviors that reflect and uphold those values within a given context. My issue when I go into governance roles as a musician with one foot in the Western world and one in the Indigenous world, and someone who advocates for community music values, I often meet organizations that are entrenched in this type of framework. So in my region, organizations and funding bodies are increasingly looking at different values or frameworks that respond more authentically with the way communities interact with arts and how arts and cultures entwine to impact their lives. So the one I most often meet is this, that professional expertise is the professional marker or primary marker of quality, the canonic repertoires as the cultural gold standard, so what we know brings in the audiences. Audience development seen primarily as marketing and ticket sales. And finally, economic return on investment as the metric of success. So in order to move forward, I often have governance groups acknowledge the problem, define new values, and implement new behaviors that will allow organizations to achieve their values. So I take a side step into a research project I was co-investigator in called Valuing the Arts. This research project built on the notion that the arts are increasingly recognized for their contribution to well-being, social inclusion, and community building, extending beyond purely economic value. The project captured the increasing emphasis on the need to think differently about attributions of value within the arts, with a stronger focus on the critical role of arts and culture in community well-being and empowerment. So this was conducted for the Queensland University of Technology with my university, and it was conducted by or funded by the Australian Council for the Arts and Manatu Taonga, the Ministry for Culture and Heritage in New Zealand. These slides will probably be made available to you, but on this slide, you'll see there is a link to the actual report. And I'll go into more depth on those findings in just a moment, but just to let you know that's there. So this project looked at previously published research and gathered narratives from interviews with key informants, including artists, peak organizations, gallery or museum staff, community cultural development organizations, funders, and researchers, illuminating the different perceptions about the public value of art. While this project was largely concerned with how impact was measured in the arts across Australia and Aotearoa New Zealand, that narratives around how the arts impacted communities and the values key informants ascribe to the arts intersects with many community music values and objectives, and therefore are an interesting add-on for this presentation. So I would like to dig down into these findings. You see the categories on the slide, but let me just talk a little bit about what the narrative said. So the informants saw public value, not only economic value. The participants agreed the normal way or the normative usage of the term is entwined with economic, but when liberated from that usage, value is powerful and seen as cultural maintenance, value as identity creation and representation, value as reimagining places and futures, and value as a safe space for questioning structures and social norms. Well-being was discussed. Participation in the arts supports mental health, emotional resilience, identity formation, and self-expression. Social inclusion. Arts engagement strengthens social cohesion, enhances community belonging, and connects people to place and heritage. The research shows that the dominant values of arts and cultural engagement is located in social bonding and bridging that allows individuals and communities to develop a sense of connectedness, self-understanding, and identity construction. Arts, culture, and creativity. So research participants stated that culture is place-based and inclusive of practice, ritual, custom, and storytelling that express people and place, as well as what is valuable and meaningful. So the research illuminated the need to make arts framing more inclusive of peoples and practices. Using the term creativity as a part of the lexicon may open up avenues of practice and meaning in a more inclusive way. And then finally, people-centered impact models. They saw a real need to develop impact assessment models and approaches that are people-centered and have flexibility to be shaped by the end user defined outcomes. So I wanted to bring those findings together with the general, what I would say, a synthesis of what scholars have described as community values. And you'll see there on the left, and these are from, people, Lee Higgins and a lot of the others have talked about what community values look like. And for me, from my own First Nations experience, art is a product of a living culture. And so they cannot be separated from one another. And within my framework, these values work. and they're very closely aligned to the values of the arts findings. So I've just made a little bit of a connection here, comparing those values, just as a slide for moving into the next, which is my case study with New Zealand Opera. I am using New Zealand Opera, which is our national opera company. It is, compared to most Western countries, very under-resourced, but it still tries to maintain a really strong connection to the Eurocentric repertoire, and patrons who support it want that repertoire. It's been a real shift, though, because the creative funding bodies are starting to say, well, no, we need to see ourselves and our place in all of the artwork that is happening in all of the art sector. So how are you going to do that, New Zealand Opera? So I put the norms practice on a slide, and I've given you some examples of what some of the problems are and what values they would like. So let me talk you through. So the board saw some of the problems as, again, coming back to the canonical repertoire as the cultural gold standard, living on this or living around this economic return on investment as the main metric of success, Eurocentric music programming, lack of local relevance, the whiteness of the tradition, which is something musicologist Anna Ball has written about. She's based in London, but a New Zealander. The lack of te reo Māori, which is an official language in New Zealand, and tikanga Māori or te ao Māori, concepts that emerge from the Māori world. And the optic. So on social media or on posters, who is represented, who belongs in this genre. And so the values New Zealand Opera came up with that they wanted to espouse as a company: place-conscious programming, supporting the conserving and development of Indigenous stories and musical practices, value opera performance as a space to create well-being and social cohesion, break down elitism by valuing and representation of cultural practices that are place-based and storytelling that expresses people and places. And impact and change is not only articulated through the goals of the funders or delivery organizations, but is understood by the people participating in the arts and cultural engagement. So rather than talk you through the behaviors that they evoked, I'm going to take you to the website, I think, and we'll just have a look at some of the things that jump out at people who perhaps would not be expecting this from a colonial country of the British variety. So we can see here immediately, this is, for a start, an interesting poster. It is for Morpheus, or a reimagining of Orfeo in the Pacific context. It uses dance and Pacific ballet and Pacific traditional dance. It also uses the chorus singing in a Pacific Island language, Samoan. So immediately we have quite a strong place-based programming choice. There was quite a lot of contention around it, but it is extraordinary to see for someone of my generation who really would never have seen myself on these posters. So when we go to New Zealand Opera's website, we can see almost immediately the photo is, again, Pacific based. It's a Pacific dance troupe, and there are several other things you can tell, and I'll just quickly go through them. First of all, you see both the Māori language and the English language. The Māori language is first because Māori arrived here first. As you go down, you'll see that every category is in Māori and English, and there's very strong attention to community. They describe here opera in Aotearoa. Notice they use the Māori word for New Zealand. Connect with Kiwi communities who might otherwise have never experienced the power of opera. It's a very strong mission. And to tell New Zealand stories that serve our communities. As we go down, we have our values. And again, they're in Māori first and English second, but these values are also very connected to Māori world values. So they're not necessarily Western derived. But I wanted to go down further. You'll see we still have Māori in English. So for example, tickets, ngā tikiti, and they're first. Te Manatoroa, the head office. And then I'm going back up here briefly to take you to this page, which is our Māori journey. So they're very committed to Indigenous storytelling, but also the culture as being underrepresented in the past, but wanting to include it in the story of New Zealand opera from now on. So our journey, Haerenga Māori, there's a full Māori paragraph at the beginning. And then as we go down, we see that we value Māori culture. And how do we do this? Well, if you go down further, you'll see we have cultural competency advisors and consultants. So the main consultant group is Te Reo Ruruku. It is made up of mostly Māori opera singers. So Kawiti Wayford went to Guildhall. Joanna Henslip was in the Mariinsky Academy in St. Petersburg. Afamai Fraser, if you've seen Moana 2, she is the person who sings the evil character, arguably has the best song in Moana 2. Deborah Waikapohi, amazing soprano. So they are all Māori who know the genre. And we have someone here who's an elder, so somebody who represents order and make sure we're sticking with the protocols of our culture. And then there's several other consultants. So they really have a lot of feedback from the community as to how they should be doing things. So I wanted to do a bit of a cross-sector comparison, really. So just in this next slide, you see the Nutcracker, which is by Royal New Zealand Ballet. Notice we still have Royal in it. And then the New Zealand Symphony Orchestra. They're the two highest funded arts organisations in New Zealand. Far more than New Zealand Opera, far more than many others. And still, the way they tell the story is, I would say, they're not as committed to inclusivity and accessibility as New Zealand Opera, even though they have much more money. I think it's an area they can work on. But I wanted to bring you to another organisation, which is the Christchurch Symphony Orchestra. And the reason I bring you to them is for other reasons, but I think important ones. They are also really not as well funded as those two main arts organisations, what I would call peak organisations. But they have Māori first, English second. And they have a fantastic program that is inclusive of stories. And if we go here, Ki Te Hapori in the community, literally they have everything in Māori and English, and they are looking at very large community music outreach. So the reason I bring those up at this point is because, from my perspective anyway, I see community music musicians as norms entrepreneurs. And what's interesting about New Zealand Opera and about Christchurch Symphony Orchestra is that they're both run by people with a real passion for community music. New Zealand Opera is a great conductor, but he is actually foremost a community music scholar. And then Christchurch Symphony Orchestra, the CEO is actually Graham Sattler, who I believe will be in the room in Dortmund when this is showing. And he's doing a fantastic work with that orchestra. So I see community musicians as non-entrepreneurs. Finnemore and Seekink claim norm entrepreneurs are a catalyst for norms emergence. So they are entrepreneurs advocating for new ideas and redefining appropriate behaviors within their disciplinary norms. They attempt to alter others' assumptions by offering alternative worldviews and possibilities. Hoffman says these align with the entrepreneur's concept of appropriate behavior. Hoffman claims established norms can be altered when norm entrepreneurs convince others to change their values from an old norm to a new one. So I suggest community musicians can be effective norm entrepreneurs and have been for some time. Arguably, I think community musicians and artists should take over the world, or at the very least, surreptitiously pervade every decision-making part of the music sector. I think we have a lot to offer to the community and for nation building. Why does this matter? Well, for me, community music is not just a practice. It is a set of values and methodologies that can renew our sector. This is not about replacing traditional institutions. It's about infusing them with deeper purpose, broader engagement, and a commitment to justice and care. In the case of Aotearoa New Zealand, it is about indigenizing a colonial structure by infusing local values into institutions and organizational strategic documents. considering this as refreshing and renewing or innovating the arts form and the sector. So, here are some final considerations. What are the norms within the arts sector in your country that are obstructing creative growth and excluding communities that deserve to participate? Arguably, the questions we ask of the arts sector must shift, or can we reframe them? So, from how do we grow our audience to how do we deepen participation? From what will generate revenue to what will generate belonging? From how do we preserve excellence to how do we expand what excellence can look and feel like, especially when it emerges from collective experience. So thank you for having me today. I will leave that with you. Thank you.